My brother broke my $5,000 wheelchair as a joke, so I sued him. The whole family was angry, but in court, I said this. My brother broke my $5,000 custom wheelchair, dismissing it as a joke, and when he refused to take responsibility, I made the difficult decision to sue him. This action ignited outrage throughout my family, but it was the only path left to reclaim my independence and hold him accountable. I'm David, 28 years old, and I've been paralyzed from the waist down for 6 years, following a life-changing accident. My wheelchair isn't just any chair, it's a custom-made device tailored to meet my specific needs, funded through savings, help from my parents, and a community fundraiser. Without it, I'm immobilized, entirely reliant on others. This isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. This all started during a family gathering at my parents' house, one of those semi-regular meetups where everyone catches up over food, while old dynamics and inevitable drama simmer beneath the surface. Among the attendees was my cousin Jack, known for being the self-proclaimed comedian of the family. Jack thrives on attention, often resorting to pranks and jokes that push the boundaries of what's acceptable. His antics have always been tolerated, partly because no one wants to confront him, and partly because it's easier to let things slide. Unfortunately, this time, his behavior caused irreparable harm. While we were all chatting in the backyard, my wheelchair was parked beside me. Jack, ever the performer, began his usual routine of juggling random objects and cracking jokes. It wasn't long before he turned his attention to my wheelchair, eyeing it with a mischievous grin. Despite my immediate warnings to leave it alone, Jack, in typical fashion, ignored me. He grabbed the wheelchair and started wheeling it around the yard, laughing and showing off. My heart sank as I yelled at him to stop, but my protests only seemed to encourage him further. Picking up speed, Jack pretended he was some sort of daredevil, careening across the yard as if my wheelchair were a toy. He tried to perform a ridiculous stunt, losing control in the process. The wheelchair crashed onto the concrete patio with a loud, sickening bang. One wheel was completely bent, and part of the frame cracked. The moment was surreal. The yard fell silent, and everyone turned to look at the wreckage. My custom wheelchair, my lifeline, was ruined. Jack stood there scratching his head, muttering a casual whoops, as though he had merely spilled a drink. His lack of remorse hit me like a punch to the gut. When I demanded he take responsibility, he laughed it off, claiming it was just a chair and accusing me of overreacting. The family quickly divided. My mom was horrified, scolding Jack for his thoughtlessness, while my dad tried to calm me down. Some relatives stayed silent, unwilling to pick sides, while Jack stubbornly refused to acknowledge the seriousness of what he had done. His dismissive attitude made it clear he wasn't going to pay for the damage. I was left with a destroyed wheelchair and no way to fix or replace it. My frustration grew as my parents attempted to mediate, but the gravity of the situation couldn't be ignored. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was my independence and quality of life at stake. After days of wrestling with my options, I decided to take legal action. It wasn't an easy choice, suing a family member felt like crossing a line, but Jack's refusal to acknowledge the harm he caused left me no alternative. I contacted Sarah, a lawyer and longtime friend, who assured me that I had a solid case. Her confidence bolstered me, though I still felt the weight of guilt for escalating the situation. However, every time I remembered Jack laughing off his actions, my resolve grew stronger. Filing the lawsuit triggered a ripple of reactions throughout my family. When Jack was served the legal papers, his fury was palpable. He accused me of being dramatic, selfish, and overreacting. Other family members took sides, with some supporting me and others urging me to drop the case to avoid ruining the family. My mom stood firmly by my side, while my dad remained conflicted, questioning whether the ensuing drama was worth it. Jack's parents, Aunt Linda and Uncle Steve, called me, oscillating between pleading and defensiveness. They argued that Jack hadn't meant any harm, imploring me to forgive and move on. Their tone quickly shifted to blame, insinuating that I was being overly sensitive. The dismissal of my very real struggles felt like a betrayal. Tensions escalated during a family Zoom call that my dad arranged in a misguided attempt to resolve the conflict. Jack joined with his lawyer, Marcus, who seemed more intent on making a mockery of the situation than resolving it. Jack smirked as he derisively referred to the lawsuit as all this nonsense over a chair. My anger boiled over as I reminded him that this wasn't just a chair, it was my lifeline, my mobility, and my independence. His blatant disregard for the impact of his actions only deepened the divide. The call took an unexpected turn when Rachel, Jack's younger sister, spoke up. She revealed that Jack had borrowed $3,000 from her the previous year and never repaid it. Her frustration was evident as she exposed his history of irresponsibility, leaving Jack visibly flustered. Her revelation confirmed what I already knew: Jack's pattern of reckless behavior had been tolerated for far too long, and it was time someone held him accountable. As the lawsuit progressed, the family rift widened. Some saw my actions as a necessary stand for justice, while others viewed them as an unforgivable attack on family unity. Through it all, I held on to the belief that this wasn't just about money or principle, it was about standing up for myself and ensuring that Jack faced the consequences of his actions. Jack's parents immediately leaped to his defense, accusing both Rachel and me of unfairly teaming up against him. Meanwhile, my mom stood firm, asserting that this wasn't about revenge, but about accountability. Despite her efforts, the call dissolved into chaos, with shouting on all sides. Overwhelmed and drained, I eventually logged off, the emotional toll of the situation weighing heavily on me. In the days that followed, the tension within my family only deepened. Some relatives began avoiding me altogether, clearly unwilling to take sides. Others, however, reached out with messages of support. My cousin Mike, whom I hadn't spoken to in months, texted to commend my decision, saying it was about time someone stood up to Jack. The mixed reactions underscored just how divisive this situation had become, but I remained committed to the lawsuit. Sarah, my lawyer, assured me we had a strong case, especially with Rachel's testimony about Jack's history of dodging responsibility. Despite my determination, the emotional strain was constant. Family gatherings would never be the same, and I couldn't shake the sense of isolation. I hadn't asked for any of this, but I knew I had to stand up for myself. Jack's reckless actions had real consequences, and it was time he faced them. The day of the trial arrived, bringing a mix of nerves and resolve. Sarah had meticulously prepared our case, but walking into the courthouse felt surreal. Jack sat on the other side of the room, flanked by his lawyer, Marcus, and his parents, Aunt Linda and Uncle Steve. He looked irritated but oddly confident, as though he thought the entire proceeding was beneath him. I was accompanied by my parents and Rachel, whose unwavering support gave me strength. The trial began with Sarah presenting the evidence. She outlined the facts with precision, starting with photos of my destroyed wheelchair and explaining how essential it was to my independence. She emphasized the impact Jack's actions had on my daily life, framing the case as more than just about property damage. This was about mobility, dignity, and accountability. Jack's lawyer, Marcus, tried to downplay the incident, portraying it as an unfortunate accident rather than an act of negligence. He painted Jack as a harmless prankster and argued that the lawsuit was an overreaction. Jack himself took the stand, sticking to his narrative that it was all just a joke gone wrong. He claimed he had no intention of causing harm and accused me of being petty for escalating the situation. His complete lack of remorse was infuriating. When Sarah cross-examined him, she didn't hold back. She got Jack to admit that I had explicitly told him not to touch my wheelchair and that he had ignored me. She also highlighted his refusal to apologize or offer any compensation after the damage was done. Jack's attempts to justify his actions began to crumble under her questioning. Rachel's testimony was another pivotal moment. She didn't mince words as she recounted Jack's long history of reckless and irresponsible behavior, emphasizing how he had consistently avoided accountability. Her revelation about the $3,000 he had borrowed and never repaid caught everyone by surprise, including his lawyer. Jack looked visibly uncomfortable, but he didn't deny her claims. His parents, however, were livid, their frustration with Rachel palpable. The judge listened carefully throughout the proceedings, occasionally asking clarifying questions. By the end of the day, it felt like the evidence and testimonies were strongly in my favor, but I couldn't relax until the verdict was announced. When the judge ruled in my favor, relief washed over me. Jack was ordered to pay $5,000 in damages. However, the victory was immediately overshadowed by Jack's reaction. He stood up abruptly, shouting about how ridiculous the case was and accusing me of ruining the family. His outburst was dramatic and disruptive, and he stormed out of the courtroom, slamming the door behind him. His parents followed quickly, their embarrassment clear, but their hostility toward me still evident. Outside the courthouse, my mom hugged me tightly, expressing how proud she was of me for standing my ground. Rachel offered a reassuring smile, telling me I had done what needed to be done and urging me not to let Jack's tantrum affect me. Despite their support, the aftermath of the trial was anything but peaceful. By the time I got home, I had messages from relatives accusing me of selfishness and blaming me for deepening the family divide. Jack even took to social media, posting inflammatory comments about how I had turned a small mistake into a major issue and betrayed the family. Winning the case brought a sense of justice, but it also came with the bittersweet realization that the family rift was now wider than ever. Jack's refusal to take responsibility and his public outburst only added fuel to the fire. I'm left wondering if things will ever settle down or if this divide is permanent. The whole experience has been exhausting, and I'm just trying to figure out how to move forward. Any advice on navigating family drama after such a contentious legal battle would be greatly appreciated. After the court ruled in my favor and ordered Jack to pay $5,000 for destroying my custom wheelchair, I thought the nightmare might finally be over. I was wrong. Jack's refusal to take responsibility and his failure to comply with the court order triggered a series of events that dragged the entire family deeper into the chaos. Initially, I waited for Jack to make the first payment. Weeks went by with no contact and no sign of repayment. I tried to remain patient, convincing myself that he might need time to gather the money. However, as another month passed without any communication, my frustration grew. Determined to address the issue directly, I reached out to Jack, aiming to keep the conversation civil. I reminded him of the court's decision and his obligation to pay, but his defensiveness was immediate. He accused me of expecting too much, claiming he was already overwhelmed by the aftermath of the lawsuit. I pointed out that he had months to prepare and could have started with even a partial payment. Instead of acknowledging the situation, Jack hung up on me. It became abundantly clear that he had no intention of taking responsibility unless he was forced to. Frustrated but resolute, I contacted Sarah, my lawyer, to discuss the next steps. She explained that I could initiate wage garnishment to ensure the payments would come directly from Jack's income. While I hated escalating the situation further, I realized it was the only way to enforce accountability. The legal process for wage garnishment took several weeks, and Jack's reaction was as volatile as expected. When he found out, he called me in a rage, accusing me of ruining his life. He claimed the garnishment was an unfair punishment on top of the lawsuit. I calmly reminded him that he had ample opportunity to make things right and chose not to. This was the consequence of his decisions, not mine. The call ended in another heated argument, with Jack continuing to cast himself as the victim. As the garnishment began, the fallout spilled into his work life. His employer was notified, and soon rumors about his financial struggles began circulating among family members. Aunt Linda called me, pleading for leniency. She insisted that Jack was having a hard time and that I should let it go. I stood my ground, explaining that this wasn't about being harsh, but about recovering the cost of something vital to my independence. Jack wasn't the victim in this situation, he was the one who had caused the harm and refused to take responsibility. A few months later, Jack's situation worsened. He lost his job at a marketing firm. Although the official reason was unrelated to the garnishment, family members speculated that the stress of his financial troubles had affected his performance. Without a steady paycheck, the garnishment halted, and Jack's financial problems quickly snowballed. He fell behind on rent, lost his car to repossession, and began borrowing money from anyone willing to lend it. Even his closest friends started distancing themselves, unwilling to be dragged into his growing mess. Rachel, who had been a steadfast ally throughout this ordeal, called me one evening to vent her frustration. Jack had shown up at her apartment asking for money, looking disheveled and desperate. She described how he blamed me for his predicament, refusing to take any responsibility for his actions. While I felt a pang of sympathy, I reminded Rachel, and myself, that Jack had every opportunity to avoid this outcome. He made the choices that led him here, and I couldn't feel guilty for holding him accountable. Rachel agreed, though she admitted it was difficult to watch Jack spiral. I felt the same way. While I didn't relish seeing him struggle, I knew this was a consequence of his refusal to take responsibility. The family drama intensified as Jack's financial troubles became impossible to ignore. Aunt Linda and Uncle Steve did their best to support him, but their resources were limited, and they couldn't cover all his debts. Meanwhile, Jack's younger brother, Nick, refused to get involved, arguing that bailing Jack out wouldn't help him in the long run. Jack's embarrassment grew, and he began avoiding family gatherings. At the same time, he started posting on social media, portraying himself as the victim in this ordeal. One particularly infuriating post read, "Some people care more about money than family." It's sad, really. The insinuation was clear, and it reignited tensions within the family. Some relatives continued to side with Jack, while others quietly supported me, recognizing the truth of the situation. Winning the lawsuit had brought a sense of justice, but the aftermath was exhausting. The divide in the family felt insurmountable, and Jack's refusal to accept responsibility only deepened the strain. While I tried to focus on moving forward, the constant drama made it difficult to find peace. At the end of the day, I knew I had done the right thing, but the cost, both emotional and relational, was higher than I had anticipated. Now, I'm left wondering if the family can ever recover or if this conflict has permanently fractured our relationships. Jack's bitter words on social media, calling me out and claiming I cared more about money than family, sent shockwaves through the already divided family. "Hope you're happy, David," he wrote, painting himself as a victim and me as the villain. The backlash was immediate. Some relatives sided with him, echoing his narrative, while others stood by me, defending my actions. My mom, ever my fiercest ally, wasn't about to let Jack's spin go unchallenged. She replied directly to his post, writing, "Jack, this situation is your own doing. David gave you every chance to make it right, and you refused. Take responsibility for your actions." While her response was validating, it did little to bridge the widening gap. Some family members began avoiding me altogether, unwilling to engage with the conflict. Others sent private messages, offering quiet words of support. Navigating the rift was exhausting. All I wanted was to replace my wheelchair and move on, but the family drama refused to let up. Meanwhile, Jack's financial troubles deepened. Without a steady job, he couldn't make progress on his debts and eventually moved back in with Aunt Linda and Uncle Steve. Through the grapevine, I heard creditors were hounding him and that he was even considering filing for bankruptcy. Despite his situation, Jack showed no signs of taking accountability. Rachel, my steadfast supporter, told me during one of our late-night calls that Jack was still playing the victim. "He keeps saying this is all your fault," she said, exasperated. "But he won't admit that he's the one who caused it." Hearing this was frustrating, though not surprising. Jack had always been skilled at deflecting blame, and this situation was no different. The ripple effects of his refusal to take responsibility spread far and wide, straining relationships throughout the family. While I hated the damage it caused, I couldn't ignore the simple truth: Jack made his choices, and it wasn't my job to fix the mess he created. One evening, Aunt Linda called, and her tone made it clear the conversation wouldn't be pleasant. "David, do you even see what's happening?" she asked, her frustration sharp. "Jack has lost his job, his car, his apartment, he's drowning in debt. Is that what you wanted? To ruin him completely?" Keeping my voice steady, I replied, "Linda, this isn't about what I wanted. It's about Jack refusing to take responsibility for destroying something essential to my life. He had every chance to make this right, and he chose not to. Her response was biting. "You've destroyed this family, David. We used to get along, and now look at us. Was it really worth it?" The accusations didn't stop with Aunt Linda. At a family dinner I reluctantly attended, my cousin Brian decided to weigh in, making it abundantly clear whose side he was on. "David, you've really gone too far with this," he said, staring at me from across the table. "Jack made a mistake. People make mistakes. But you couldn't let it go, and now the family is a mess because of it." I felt my chest tighten. "A mistake?" I said, my voice low but firm. "He wrecked my wheelchair and refused to pay for it. I didn't ask for this mess. Jack created it by ignoring every opportunity to make things right." Brian scoffed, shaking his head. "Maybe if you'd handled it differently, we wouldn't all be sitting here on opposite sides." At that moment, my mom, who had been sitting quietly up until then, finally spoke up. Her voice was calm but sharp, cutting through the tension. "Brian, don't you dare put this on David. Jack brought this on himself. If he'd taken responsibility from the start, none of this would have happened." The table fell into an uneasy silence, the air thick with unspoken words. The tension was palpable, and while my mom's defense gave me some comfort, it was clear that the family division was far from healing. Not everyone was against me, though. Rachel remained firmly in my corner, her support a lifeline amid the chaos. "This isn't about you ruining the family," she reminded me during another late-night call. "This is about Jack finally facing the consequences of his actions. Some people just don't want to accept that." Her words were a balm, but they couldn't ease the growing tension within the family. The situation reached a breaking point during another gathering at my parents' house. What was supposed to be a small get-together quickly became charged with unspoken hostility. Aunt Linda and Uncle Steve greeted me with icy stares, while Brian avoided me altogether. Jack, who had inexplicably decided to attend, wasted no time making his feelings known. As we sat down to eat, he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Glad to see some people are still welcome here after ruining the family." I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay calm. "Jack," I said, my voice steady, "if you have something to say, just say it." "Oh, I think everyone here knows what I mean," he shot back, his tone dripping with bitterness. "You couldn't let it go. You had to drag it out in court, take my money, and destroy my life, all over a stupid chair." Before I could respond, Rachel stepped in, her voice firm and unwavering. "That stupid chair was David's independence, Jack. You destroyed it, laughed about it, and refused to pay for the damage. Don't act like you're the victim here." Her words cut through the room, silencing Jack and everyone else. The tension hung heavy, and while Rachel's defense was powerful, it was clear the fractures in the family weren't going to heal anytime soon. The ordeal with Jack had left scars that ran deep, not just for me, but for everyone involved. The room erupted into chaos as Aunt Linda's voice rose above the din, yelling at Rachel to stay out of family matters. My mom, ever the defender of justice, launched into a counter-argument, staunchly supporting me against anyone who dared to criticize my actions. My dad, trying desperately to maintain peace, urged everyone to calm down, but it was no use. The argument spiraled out of control, and one by one, family members began leaving in anger, their voices trailing off as they stormed out. After that explosive night, the family felt more fractured than ever. Some relatives cut off contact with me entirely, while others went out of their way to offer quiet support. My cousin Nick, who had largely stayed out of the drama, surprised me with a phone call the next day. His words were like a lifeline amid the storm. He told me he didn't blame me for any of it and that Jack needed to face reality. It was a rare moment of encouragement in what had become an overwhelmingly isolating experience. Despite Nick's reassurance, the weight of the division was heavy. Family gatherings became minefields, with separate camps forming and lingering tension seeping into every interaction. Some relatives, like Aunt Linda, never missed an opportunity to voice their criticism, while others, like Rachel and Nick, made it clear they were firmly in my corner. Unexpectedly, Jack called me one afternoon. Seeing his name on my phone sent a rush of conflicting emotions through me: frustration, hesitation, and a twinge of curiosity. I answered cautiously, bracing for whatever he had to say. His tone, however, took me by surprise. It was subdued, stripped of the arrogance I'd come to expect from him. He began by admitting he'd been thinking a lot about everything that had happened. He acknowledged how much he'd messed up, not just with the wheelchair, but with how he'd handled everything afterward. For the first time, he sounded genuinely remorseful, apologizing for the pain he'd caused and for avoiding responsibility. His words caught me off guard. While part of me wanted to believe him, another part remained wary. After everything, could I trust his sincerity? I told him I appreciated his apology, but emphasized that actions, not words, would determine whether he was serious about making amends. He sighed, acknowledging the uphill battle ahead. He promised to try, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a faint glimmer of hope that he might mean it. A few days later, Jack showed up at my door with a duffel bag in hand. He looked uncharacteristically nervous as he asked if he could stay for a week. Things at Aunt Linda and Uncle Steve's house had become tense, and he needed space to figure things out. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to have him in my home after everything he'd put me through. Against my better judgment, I agreed, hoping this might be an opportunity for him to prove he was genuinely trying to change. At first, Jack seemed committed to showing he was serious about turning over a new leaf. He helped with cooking, cleaned up after himself, and even apologized again during dinner one night. His voice was quieter, more introspective, as he admitted he was trying to figure out how to rebuild not just his relationship with me, but with the entire family. While I appreciated his effort, trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, and I remained cautious. By the middle of the week, cracks began to show. One evening, while we were watching TV, Jack made a joke about the lawsuit, laughing nervously as he quipped about learning not to mess with expensive chairs. The comment struck a nerve. I turned to him, unamused, and reminded him that what had happened wasn't a joke. He mumbled an apology, admitting he still didn't always know how to express himself without humor. While his admission felt genuine, it didn't erase the sting of his words. Another time, during a conversation about family dynamics, he remarked that now I was the one with half the family upset at me. The comment felt like a jab, even if he didn't intend it that way. I reminded him that the fallout had affected me deeply, not just emotionally, but in every aspect of my life. His sigh of acknowledgement showed a glimmer of understanding, but it was clear we were still miles apart in how we viewed the situation. By the end of the week, Jack packed his bag and thanked me for letting him stay. He admitted he had a long way to go, but hoped I would give him the chance to keep proving he was serious about making amends. I nodded, but internally, I wasn't sure what the future held for our relationship. The trust that had been shattered would take more than a week to repair, and I needed time to focus on my own healing. Over the following months, life slowly began to stabilize. The damage Jack caused, to my wheelchair, to our relationship, and to the family, left lasting scars, but I knew I couldn't let it define me. I worked hard to save enough money to purchase a new wheelchair, one that cost $7,500, significantly more than the last, but worth every penny. This new chair was more than just a tool for mobility, it symbolized resilience and a fresh start. With the renewed sense of independence my wheelchair provided, I began pursuing new interests. Photography, something I'd always enjoyed casually, became a passion. I started visiting parks and cityscapes, capturing moments through the lens of my camera. On one trip, I met Carla, a fellow wheelchair user who shared my interest in photography. Her fierce independence and encouragement inspired me to join a local photography group, where I found a supportive community. Through this group and Carla's connections, I began volunteering to mentor others with mobility challenges. One of the most rewarding experiences was helping Malik, a teenager adjusting to life in a wheelchair after a spinal injury. Seeing his journey reminded me of my own struggles and triumphs, and mentoring him felt like a way to pay forward the support I'd received over the years. Meanwhile, my photography blossomed. I upgraded my equipment, honed my skills, and built an online portfolio. Sharing my photos on social media brought unexpected attention, with followers drawn to the mix of landscapes, urban scenes, and personal reflections on resilience. A post featuring my new wheelchair, accompanied by a message about perseverance, went viral, drawing thousands of likes and comments from people who resonated with my story. Amid this personal growth, Jack reached out again. Over the months, he had been slowly paying off his debt. His payments, inconsistent at first, became more regular after he secured a job at a warehouse. When he made the final payment, he showed up at my door with an envelope in hand. He handed it to me, his expression a mix of nervousness and resolve. "I wanted to give this to you in person," he said. "I know it doesn't make up for everything I did, but I hope it's a step in the right direction." I accepted the envelope and thanked him. As he lingered on the porch, he finally said what I had hoped to hear for months. He admitted he had avoided responsibility, blamed me, and made things worse for everyone. His apology felt sincere, and for the first time I believed he might truly be trying to change. While I appreciated his efforts, I reminded him that rebuilding trust would take time. He nodded, expressing gratitude that I was even willing to talk to him. As much as I wanted to forgive him completely, the wounds were still fresh. For now, I focused on moving forward, determined to build a life defined not by past conflicts, but by resilience and growth. Jack's efforts gave me hope, but only time would tell if our relationship could truly heal.